By the end of a single day in August of 1942, nearly 800 Japanese soldiers would be dead on a strip of sand no wider than a country road, and the assumption that had sent them forward would die with them. Their commander had advanced as though one hard night attack would be enough. His decision alone revealed the scale of his miscalculation. He was sending fewer than 1,000 men against a Marine position whose true strength he had badly underestimated. And the story of exactly how badly he had misjudged his enemy, and how many men would spend the next 3 years learning the same lesson one island at a time, begins on the east bank of a shallow creek on an island called Guadalcanal. You will not find Guadalcanal on most maps without looking for it. It is one island in a long chain called the Solomons, scattered across the southwestern Pacific like stepping stones, most of them covered in a jungle so thick and so wet that a man could stand 10 feet from another and never know he was there. It rains there in a way people from cooler places find hard to imagine, a heavy, drumming, endless rain that soaks everything, and then when it stops, leaves a heat that presses down like a hand. The ground turns to a mud that pulls at the boots. The insects never rest. Disease lives in the water and the air. It was not a place anyone would have chosen to fight over if the fighting had been about the place itself. It never was. It was about what could be built on it and what could fly from it, and who would control the sky and the sea for 1,000 miles in every direction. In the summer of 1942, almost no one in America had ever heard the name Guadalcanal. By the end of that year, it would be burned into the memory of an entire generation, because Guadalcanal became the first major American ground offensive against Japan and the beginning of a sustained campaign that the Japanese could not quickly reverse. For 6 months, the Imperial Army had swept across Asia and the Pacific almost without a serious check, from one victory to the next, faster than anyone had thought possible. On Guadalcanal, for the first time, the Americans were pushing back, and, more than that, they were staying. They had come ashore, they had taken the ground that mattered, and they had made it clear they did not intend to leave. For the men on the other side, that alone was something new to reckon with. The tide, which had run one way for half a year, was about to be tested. On the night of the 21st of August, 1942, close to 900 Japanese soldiers rose out of the sand grass on the far bank of a shallow creek and ran toward a line of dug-in American Marines. Their commander was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki. He was roughly 50 years old, a career infantry officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, a veteran of the fighting in China, a man who had spent his adult life in uniform and had every reason, or so it must have seemed to him, to trust his own judgment. Whatever Ichiki believed about American fighting spirit, his operational decision revealed one assumption beyond dispute. He had badly underestimated the force in front of him. He had studied the American landing, and he had concluded that a single determined night assault would be enough to break them. Understand the confidence behind that decision, because it did not come from nowhere. For 6 months, Japan's armies had accumulated one stunning victory after another. Singapore had fallen, a fortress the British had believed would hold, surrendering with tens of thousands of men inside it. The Philippines had fallen. Across a vast arc of the map, Western forces, dug in and supposedly prepared, had surrendered in numbers almost unimaginable before the war began. Ichiki was advancing in the long shadow of those victories, and his decision showed just how deeply they had shaped his expectations. Everywhere the Imperial Army had gone, the story had run the same way. The defenders held for a while, and then they broke. That was simply what happened. It was the pattern of the entire war so far, unbroken. And so, when the plan called for a swift, hard night attack to shatter the American line and reopen the way to the airfield, it must have seemed less like a gamble than like the natural next chapter of a story that had only ever ended one way. He was about to learn that he was looking at something the war had not produced yet. So he sent his men across the sand in the dark. The creek had a name the Marines would carry with them for the rest of their lives: Alligator Creek. It was barely more than a ribbon of brackish water, ankle-deep in places, a thin, dark seam between the wall of jungle and the open sea. On the far bank, the Marines of the 1st Division waited behind wire and sandbagged machine guns, listening to the grass move in the dark. They had heard the enemy gathering. They knew something was coming, out there in the black beyond their wire, though they could not yet see it. And in the last hour before it came, there was that particular silence that soldiers know and civilians never quite do. The silence of men lying very still in the dark, hands on their weapons, mouths dry, each one alone with his own fear. all of them waiting together for the night to break open. Then it broke. The first wave came fast, and it came screaming, a mass of men rushing across the open sandbar toward the American line, and for a few minutes the noise alone was enough to make a man wonder if the line would hold. Muzzle flashes stitched the darkness. Tracer fire crossed the sandbar in flat, burning lines. So many of them that the night itself seemed to be made of nothing but light and motion and sound. Men fell into the shallow water, and the water carried them away, and still more came on behind. The Japanese soldiers threw themselves forward with a courage that no one who was there ever denied, into the open, into the fire, and they kept coming when every instinct a man is born with would tell him to stop. But courage was not the question that night. Courage was never going to be the question. The only question that mattered was whether the American line would break under the weight of it, and it did not. The fighting did not end at dawn, the way a single reckless charge might have. This is a detail worth holding on to, because it tells you what kind of battle this really was, and what kind of battles were still to come. It was not one wild rush that spent itself in an hour and was over. It ground on through the darkness, and then through the gray of first light, and then on into the afternoon as the Marines held their ground and slowly, methodically, turned the tide back against the men who had attacked them. In the last hours of daylight, Marine tanks rolled forward across that same sandbar, over the very ground where the assault had come, and closed the battle for good. By the time it was over, nearly 800 of Ichiki's men were dead. Only 15 were captured alive, among the very first Japanese soldiers of the entire war taken prisoner in any meaningful number. And that number 15 tells its own quiet story because it points at something that would haunt this whole campaign from beginning to end. An enemy who, for the most part, would not surrender, and could not be made to, and would therefore have to be defeated almost to the last man on every island still to come. Colonel Ichiki did not survive the disaster he had ordered. He had been certain. He had looked at his enemy and misjudged badly what he saw, and he had staked the lives of his men on that misjudgment. And his certainty was spent for nothing on 100 yards of open sand. He would not be the last officer in this story to make that exact trade. He was only the first. This is the first thing you need to understand about the story you are about to hear, because it will matter all the way to the end. This is not simply a story about American Marines fighting with courage, because every army in that war produced courage, and courage alone explains nothing. The Japanese soldiers who died at Alligator Creek were not cowards. They crossed open ground into machine gun fire because they were ordered to, and they did it without hesitation. And a great many of them died still moving forward toward the guns in the dark. To tell this story as a simple tale of brave Americans and cowardly enemies would be a lie, and worse than a lie, it would miss the entire point. The men on the other side were not lacking in courage. They were lacking in something else. Something their whole understanding of war had assured them the enemy did not have, and structurally could not have, and they would spend 3 years discovering in 7 distinct ways exactly how wrong that assurance had been. What follows are 7 recurring shocks, 7 assumptions that the Pacific War broke, again and again revealed through Japanese reports and post-war interrogations, through American operational records, and, just as importantly, through the cold and undeniable evidence of the battlefield itself. Some of these you can read in the words "the losing side left behind." Others are written in something far harder to argue with than any words, in casualty lists, in the length of battles that were supposed to be short, in the plain arithmetic of how many men went in and how few ever came out. And running underneath all 7, tying them together, is a single question. One, the battlefield record itself keeps forcing back to the surface, island after island, year after year. What was it exactly about this enemy that Japanese strategy kept failing to account for? Hold on to that question, carry it with you through everything that follows, because the answer is waiting at the very end of this, and once you finally hear it, you will understand every death in between. To understand why each of those 7 shocks landed as hard as it did, you first have to understand the assumption that ran through so much of Japanese strategic thinking before the war ever began. Japan's leaders knew one hard truth better than anyone else alive. They could not outproduce the United States, and they could not win a long war of attrition against it. They had done the arithmetic themselves, and the arithmetic was merciless. So their entire strategy depended, from the start, on winning the one thing that raw production could never give them: time. seized the resource-rich territories to the south, the oil and the rubber and the metal that Japan itself did not have, build a strong defensive perimeter around all of it, cripple America's ability to interfere. The Navy dreamed of a single, decisive fleet-up battle that would sheeter American sea power in one enormous blow, and then make the eventual cost of clawing all of it back so high, so bloody, so slow that Washington might finally choose to negotiate a settlement rather than fight the whole long, terrible way across the ocean to Japan itself. That last piece, the belief that America could be made to negotiate, rested on a very specific reading of the enemy. It was a powerful idea and a genuinely dangerous one. It held that the United States possessed enormous material strength, but might lack the political will to sustain a long and bloody Pacific conflict to its bitter end. And it was not an entirely foolish idea either. That is precisely what made it so dangerous. America in the 1930s had been sunk deep in economic depression, turned inward, wary of foreign entanglements, with a small army and very little visible appetite for distant wars. From across the ocean in Tokyo, it was entirely possible to look at that America and see a rich, comfortable, deeply divided nation that would not want to spend the lives of its sons on a scattering of islands most of its citizens could not have found on a map. Democracies, the thinking went, produced comfortable citizens, and comfortable citizens would not want to die for coral atolls nobody back home had ever heard of. The whole grand plan turned in the end on a single bet, that Japan could break the enemy's willingness to keep fighting before America's overwhelming industrial superiority could fully enter the war and settle it. Guadalcanal was where that bet first began to come apart at the seams, and Ichiki's failure, it turned out, was only the very beginning of the unraveling. Weeks later, another Japanese commander arrived on the same island to try again, this time with a larger force and considerably more patience. His name was Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi. He was an experienced officer, and he had no intention of repeating the mistake of a single reckless charge across open ground. He landed thousands of men. He moved them through the jungle, and that alone was no small feat, on an island where the jungle swallowed roads and men and time and whole days of daylight. And he launched a coordinated assault against a ridge just south of the American airfield. That airfield was the entire reason anyone was fighting and dying on Guadalcanal at all. Whoever held it controlled the skies over that whole stretch of the Pacific, and with the skies a great deal else besides. And the ridge Kawaguchi chose to attack was a low, grassy spine of high ground the Marines had dug into precisely because it commanded the approaches to everything that mattered. The Americans held the ridge. They held it through repeated night attacks, one after another out of the dark. They held it through fighting so close and so desperate that men swung rifles as clubs and grappled hand to hand in the grass in the black, unable to tell friend from enemy except by the sound and the shape of him. They held it through long hours in which the outcome genuinely, truly hung in the balance. There were moments that night when the Japanese assault came very close to breaking clean through, when the American line bent almost to the point of snapping and the airfield beyond it lay open and undefended in the dark. But the line held. It bent, and it held, and it held. And by the time the sun finally came up over the ridge, Kawaguchi's assault had collapsed, and his surviving men were falling back into the jungle, carrying their wounded with them, leaving their dead on the slopes of a piece of high ground that would go down in the histories under more than one name. And Kawaguchi was left, as Ichiki had been, to account for what had happened. But his was a harder failure to explain than Ichiki's, in its way, because he had done so much of it right. He had avoided Ichiki's exact mistake. He had attacked with a much larger force and a far more deliberate, carefully coordinated plan, and yet the line had still held. He would later describe Guadalcanal in words that captured the full scale of the disaster he had witnessed. It had become, he said, a graveyard of the Japanese army. Think for a moment about who reached for that phrase. Not an American reporter looking for a headline, not a piece of Allied propaganda designed to raise morale on the home front. A serving Japanese general, a professional soldier, a patriot, describing in the bleakest terms he could summon what his enemy had cost his army. He survived to say it. Others would not be so lucky, but they would leave their own record behind, one after another, on island after island, for 3 long years to come. And that is the thread to follow through everything that comes next. Not the battles themselves, spectacular and terrible as so many of them were, but the men who lost them sitting down afterward and trying to explain to their superiors, who very much did not want to hear it, or to their wives and families, who would read the words only much later, if at all, or sometimes to no one at all, except the cold and permanent record, why the enemy in front of them simply would not behave the way everything they had ever been taught swore that he must. Ichiki had attacked with too few men and a fatal contempt for his enemy, and the line had held. Kawaguchi had attacked with more men and a far better plan, and the line had held anyway. That was 2 cracks, now, in a wall the Japanese army had spent a full generation carefully building. There were 5 more still to come, and the men who would discover them had not yet even set foot on the islands where it would happen. One of them was a young sergeant from a small town in New Jersey who was already, at that very moment, somewhere on Guadalcanal, a man whose machine guns would soon become part of Marine Corps legend, and whose name the enemy on the other side of the wire would never learn and would never forget. Another was a Japanese general who understood the United States better than almost any officer in the entire Imperial Army, and who already suspected the terrible truth about the enemy his country had chosen to fight. But both of those men are getting ahead of the story. For now, hold on to the image of that riverbank in the dark. 900 men sent forward against an enemy their commander had badly underestimated, and a line of frightened young Americans dug into the sand who simply, stubbornly did not break. 2 months after Kawaguchi's defeat, the Japanese army came back to that same contested stretch of ground with a plan built to finish, once and for all, what the others had started. On the night of the 24th of October, 1942, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama tested the doctrine directly and with very nearly everything he had. His Sendai Division was one of the finest formations in the entire Imperial Army, a proud unit with a long and distinguished history, and Maruyama meant to break the American line with it once and for all. But before he could break anything, he first had to get it into position. And on Guadalcanal, simply getting into position was itself a battle, one fought not against the enemy at all, but against the island. To reach the American lines from the direction he had chosen, Maruyama had ordered his men to haul artillery pieces through jungle so dense that even pack mules could not follow, along a route his own mapmakers had optimistically labeled the Maruyama Trail, as though the simple act of putting a name on a thing could somehow tame it. It was not a trail in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a line drawn on a map straight through some of the most brutal terrain anywhere in the Pacific. Ravines that had to be climbed hand over hand, rivers that had to be forded in the current with the guns, mud that pulled the boots from men's feet, and day by day the strength from their legs. For days on end, his soldiers dragged those heavy guns through all of it by hand, in a heat that never once broke, and a rain that never seemed to stop, sleeping in the mud when they slept at all, running dangerously low on food long before they ever laid eyes on a single American. By the time they finally reached the lines south of Henderson Field, the trail had already beaten them half to death. They had lost most of their heavy weapons, abandoned back in the jungle, one by one, when it became simply impossible to drag them a single foot farther. They had lost a large share of their fighting strength to the terrain alone, before a single shot had been fired in anger. Men who had begun the march as fresh soldiers reached its end as exhausted, half-starved survivors of a battle against the island itself. And Maruyama, having lost so much of his striking power just getting his men to the start line, now faced a hard decision. He could wait and rest his exhausted men, and in doing so lose all element of surprise. Or he could send them forward now, spent as they were, and trust that sheer weight of numbers and Japanese fighting spirit would somehow carry the day. He sent them forward. At the very center of the American line, on the exact stretch of ground his men were about to strike hardest, stood 2 machine gun sections from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, and in command of them was a sergeant 25 years old from Raritan, New Jersey. His name was John Basilone. Remember that name, because you are going to hear it again, in a place far worse than this one, in a way you are not going to forget. Basilone was not a large man, and there was nothing about him that a stranger passing on the street would ever have marked as extraordinary. He was the son of a tailor, one of 10 children, from an ordinary town in an ordinary corner of America. He had served a peacetime hitch in the army before joining the Marines, some of it out in the Philippines, and it was there that he had picked up the nickname his friends would use for the rest of his short life, Manila John. He was not a general. He was not a hero out of a recruiting poster. He was a working sergeant, good at his job, trusted by the men above him, liked by the men beside him. And on the night of the 24th of October, He was a working sergeant with 2 machine guns, a small handful of men, and a section of line that the entire remaining weight of Maruyama's assault was about to come down upon. The attack came in waves, and it came for the better part of 2 days and 2 nights. It came out of the dark first, wave after wave after wave of Japanese infantry rushing the American positions, and the machine guns answered them, hammering out into the blackness until the barrels glowed a dull red and the water in the cooling jackets boiled away. When the guns on his flank fell silent, their crews killed or wounded, that section of the line suddenly in real danger of being overrun, Basilone did not stay in the relative safety of his own emplacement and wait for orders. He left it under fire and crossed open ground in the dark to reach an idle gun, and he worked it himself until his men could get it running again and the line was whole once more. And when the ammunition ran low, as it did again and again through those endless hours, he did not wait for it to be carried forward to him. He went back for it himself, through the same fire he had already crossed once, and brought it up in his own arms, so that the guns would not fall silent when the next wave came out of the dark. And the next wave always came. The Japanese infantry kept attacking hour after hour after hour, long after the sound alone, that ceaseless, hammering, mechanical roar of the guns, should have told any rational officer that the position simply could not be taken by feeding more bodies into it. And still they came, because that was the doctrine, and the doctrine held that will would carry the day, that the enemy would break, in the end, if only enough pressure, enough death, enough sheer relentless force were applied to him. So they applied it in full, with their own lives, wave after wave. Across the wider battle for Henderson Field, Japanese forces suffered thousands of casualties. And Maruyama's attacking formations were shattered, thrown against a line that held when everything the Japanese army believed told it. The line should have long since given way. The Sendai Division, one of the finest in the entire Imperial Army, was broken on that ground. That was the first shock. And crucially, it was not about the courage of the men behind those guns, because the Japanese fully expected courage. They had courage of their own in abundance, more than enough. And they had already watched the Americans display it, and courage was never the thing that surprised them. The thing that surprised them, the thing their entire strategy had somehow never once accounted for, was that the line did not break when the doctrine had promised, absolutely promised, that it would. They had been taught, and they had genuinely believed that enough pressure, enough death, enough sheer unrelenting pain would always, eventually, find and reach the breaking point of a democracy's soldiers. It was an article of faith. At Alligator Creek, and again south of Henderson Field, they applied that pressure in full, and they found no breaking point at all. What the survivors carried away with them from that place was something far simpler than any theory a staff college could teach. They had attacked, repeatedly, with everything they had, against men they had been told would run. And the men had not run. They carried that single hard fact north with them, from island to bloody island, for 3 long years, a small, cold truth that no amount of fighting spirit in the world could ever quite argue away. The second shock followed directly from the first. But it took Japanese command far longer to absorb, because at first glance it looked less like a strength than like a weakness. American forces would risk healthy men and lose some of them in order to save wounded ones, again and again and again, even when the rescue carried no tactical value whatsoever. Even when a colder arithmetic, the kind of hard, unsentimental arithmetic a hard-pressed army learns to make when it's must, would simply have written the fallen man off and moved the line forward without him. To an outside observer trained in a harsher school of war, it could look almost like a flaw, a sentimentality, a softness that a truly serious army could not afford to indulge. But it was not a flaw at all. It was a source of strength so deep and so foreign that a doctrine built on entirely different principles had no real way even to measure it. And Japanese riflemen had already watched it happen with their own eyes, only months before the fighting on Iwo Jima, on the coral ridges rising above the invasion beaches of an island called Peleliu. There, the naval bombardment that was supposed to have softened the island had barely scratched the caves cut deep into those ridges. And from inside them, back in the shadows and the terrible heat, Japanese defenders watched something their own way of war had no place for, no category for, no words for. American Navy corpsmen, the hospital men who went into battle right alongside the Marines, moving forward across open ground, in full view under fire to reach the wounded. Their job was not to kill. With medical kits slung across their bodies, they exposed themselves again and again and again to enemy fire in order to reach a fallen Marine lying bleeding in the open sun, to drag him back, to bind his wounds, to keep him alive one more hour. Some of them were hit doing exactly that, and some, once they had been patched up themselves, went right back out again the very same afternoon to the next wounded man, and then the next one after him, as if there were simply no version of the situation, none at all, in which they would consider stopping. That was the second shock. And the striking part of it was not simply the raw physical courage of the corpsmen, remarkable as that plainly was. It was what that willingness revealed about how the Americans fought, that they would deliberately expose more men and accept more risk to those men in order to bring back a single soldier who could no longer fire a rifle, who could no longer contribute anything at all to the fight in front of them. To a way of thinking that measured a soldier's worth by what he could still give to the battle, this was very close to incomprehensible, but it was not sentimentality, whatever it may have looked like from inside those caves. It was a manifestation of unit cohesion so total that it reached down and shaped tactics themselves, and of a medical doctrine built upon a single, stubborn, unyielding principle that no wounded man was ever written off while there remained any chance at all of reaching him. It was the kind of thing that cost an army enormous continuous effort and enormous continuous risk to sustain across years of fighting, and the Americans sustained it on beach after beach, island after island, year after year, as though the cold arithmetic of it had somehow simply never once occurred to any of them. There was one Japanese general who grasped what an enemy like that would truly mean, and he grasped it earlier and more clearly than very nearly anyone else in the Imperial Army. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was in his early 50s, and he was unlike almost any other senior officer his country had, because years before the war he had actually lived among the very people his nation would one day choose to fight. As a military attaché, he had traveled widely across the United States. He had toured American army posts. He had seen American factories with his own eyes. He had watched ordinary American life up close in a way that almost none of his colleagues back in Tokyo ever had. He had ridden American trains across a continent so vast and so unimaginably heavy with steel mills and grain elevators and endless rolling lines of automobiles that it left a mark on him no amount of official propaganda could ever quite scrub away. He had seen firsthand the sheer raw industrial weight of the country his nation would eventually decide to attack. Those years spent inside the United States had taught Kuribayashi something far broader than any single lesson a battlefield could ever offer. Americans, he understood, possessed enormous material resources, more by far than Japan could ever realistically hope to match in a long war. But American commanders, he also understood, cared intensely about the lives of their individual men. And a commander who genuinely understood both of those things at once, the immense strength and the deep aversion to loss, could draw one brutally practical conclusion from putting them together. Japan could not win a place like Iwo Jima in any ordinary sense of the word win. That was simply off the table. But what Japan could do was make the winning of it cost as much as it could possibly be made to cost. When the time finally came to design the defense of that island, Kuribayashi's objective would be precisely that, not victory, which he knew perfectly well was impossible, but to prolong the battle as long as humanly possible, and to make the price of it, in American lives and American time, as staggeringly high as one small island could ever be made to charge. But that grim reckoning was still to come. First, 4 more of the 7 shocks had to land, and the third of them was not about courage at all. It was about arithmetic, and arithmetic frightened Japanese planners more than very nearly anything else in the entire war, because a brave man can be killed, and a clever tactic can be countered, but arithmetic cannot be outfought or outwilled or overcome by any amount of spirit. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the garrison on Betio, the main island of Tarawa Atoll, far out in the Central Pacific, and he had genuine solid reason for his confidence. He had not been handed a bare stretch of open beach to defend with a few machine guns and a prayer. He had been given time and material, and he had used both of them well. His engineers, working together with more than 1,000 laborers, had spent the better part of a year transforming a strip of sand smaller than New York's Central Park into one of the single most heavily fortified pieces of ground anywhere in the entire Pacific Ocean. Stop and think about that comparison for just a moment. A piece of land you could walk across in a matter of minutes, smaller than a city park. and onto it they had packed 14 coastal guns, some of them large enough to seriously threaten warships offshore. Hundreds of machine gun positions carefully sited so that their fields of fire crossed and overlapped one another, so that every single foot of the approaches was covered by more than one gun at once. Bunkers with walls thick enough to simply shrug off naval shells, roofed over with coconut logs and concrete and sand, dug in so low and built so solid that a battleship's main guns could pound them directly and the men inside would live through it. Shibasaki is said to have told his men that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. Historians still debate to this day whether he ever actually spoke those precise words. But whether he said them aloud or not, the confidence behind them was entirely real, and it was carved into every single bunker on that island. The assault began on the 20th of November 1943, and the tide was against the landing force before the first assault wave ever reached the reef. This was not the enemy's doing, this was the sea's. A low, unlucky tide left the coral reef surrounding Bitio exposed at exactly the wrong depth, a depth that would go on to decide the fate of hundreds of men. The amphibious tractors of the first waves, built specifically to crawl up and over obstacles, could grind their way across that reef. But many of the conventional landing craft coming in behind them simply could not. They drew too much water. They ground to a dead halt against the coral, hundreds of yards from the beach, with the shore only a distant line ahead of them and open water on every side. And so the Marines aboard those boats did the only thing there was left to do. They climbed out, down into the sea itself, and for many of them what followed was a long walk through the lagoon under fire, nearly 500 yards for some units of open water, chest deep, rifles held up overhead to keep them clear of the water, into machine gun fire that crossed the lagoon from 3 separate directions all at once. Picture it if you possibly can, because the men who lived through it never once forgot it for the rest of their lives. Hundreds of yards of open, waist-deep water, flat and bright and utterly without cover of any kind under the tropical morning sun. Not a rock, not a wall, not so much as a single fold in the ground, nothing anywhere to hide behind. And a man wading through it, one slow, impossibly heavy step at a time, holding his rifle up over his head, while the water all around him is lashed white by gunfire, and the men to his left and his right fall and do not rise again. Some went under and never came back up, dragged straight down by the sheer weight of the packs. There had been no time to shed. It is one of the most terrible single images the entire Pacific War ever produced. Men walking slowly, deliberately into fire they could not escape and could not even shoot back at, because the only way forward was simply forward. And they took it. It took in the end not 100 years but 76 hours, and not 1,000,000 men but 18,000. Admiral Shibasaki himself was killed early in the fighting. And when it was finally, mercifully over, the whole terrible arithmetic of that island stood laid bare in a single staggering figure. Of the Japanese garrison, only 17 servicemen were taken alive. 17. Another 129 Korean laborers, men who had been brought to the island for the express purpose of building the very defenses that had just been destroyed all around them, also survived. Out of a garrison of roughly 4,500, that was all. By the end, the overwhelming majority of the Japanese garrison and most of the Korean labor force trapped there alongside it were simply dead. But it was not the failure of any boast that truly unsettled the Japanese high command in the end. It was what that failure revealed underneath about a far deeper miscalculation. Japan's wartime economy was, by most estimates, smaller than 1/6 the size of America. And here at last, the deepest single truth of the whole war comes fully into focus. Japan could build more ships, its shipyards worked hard, and new vessels genuinely did come off the slipways. What Japan could not do was replace ships, and trained air crews and fuel, and industrial capacity, all at once, and all at anything remotely approaching the sheer rate that America could. When the United States lost an aircraft carrier, more of them, and better ones, were already coming down the slipways behind it, more than any enemy on Earth could ever realistically hope to sink. But the gap in steel, as wide and as fatal as it was not even the widest gap of all. The widest gap was in men, and specifically in trained men. By the middle of 1944, an American naval aviator could arrive at his carrier squadron after roughly 2 full years of training and around 300 hours logged in the air, a genuinely, fully prepared combat pilot, with hundreds more just like him already waiting in the pipeline behind. Japan, meanwhile, had watched its own irreplaceable corps of veteran pilots die, squadron by squadron by squadron, in the waters off Midway, and off the Solomons, and off the Marianas, and those veterans, once lost, simply could not be replaced in kind. By the last year of the war, some Japanese pilots were entering combat with barely 100 hours of flying time to their names, sent up against an enemy whose training and replacement pipeline Japan could no longer even dream of matching. That was the third shock, and it was the one the Japanese could least afford of them all to have finally learned, because there was no courage, and no tactic, and no amount of spirit anywhere in the world that could ever answer it. You cannot outdie a factory. The fourth shock struck directly at something Japanese command culture held very nearly sacred, the deep belief that an army's fighting spirit flows downward, always downward, from its commanders to its men. Kill the officer, the thinking went, and the men beneath him lose their direction, and soon after they lose their direction, they lose their will to go on at all. It was not, in itself, an unreasonable theory. Far from it. It described, quite accurately, how a great many conscript armies throughout all of human history had actually behaved on the battlefield. Cut off the head, and the body falters and falls. It was one of the oldest ideas in all of warfare. It simply did not describe American Marine rifle squads on the black volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, because American infantry training assumed, right from the very beginning, that officers would die. It assumed that radios would fail at the worst possible moment. It assumed that a private first class, an ordinary rifleman, with no rank whatsoever to speak of, might suddenly find himself the single most senior man left alive on a contested stretch of beach, with no orders coming down from anyone, anywhere. And it assumed that he would need to know exactly what to do anyway, so it taught him. Every Marine, not merely the ones wearing rank on their collars, but every single man in the line, was trained to know the objective, to genuinely understand what the unit as a whole was trying to accomplish, and to keep moving toward it, no matter who was left standing to give the order. And the truly remarkable part, the part that struck the men watching from the other side so very hard, was not that individual Marines were fearless. It was that Marine units were built, deliberately and from the ground up, to keep right on functioning even after their leaders had become casualties. Responsibility could pass downward, often in a matter of mere seconds, because the junior leaders, the corporals, and sometimes even the ordinary privates, were expected to act on their own judgment rather than to stop and wait for instruction. A squad that lost its sergeant did not stop and huddle and look around anxiously for someone to come and tell it what to do next. The next man in simply took it up and kept it moving forward, and the man after him if it came to that. Japanese command culture, by contrast, generally placed a far greater emphasis on strict obedience to an established chain of command, on orders flowing cleanly down from above. American small unit practice, comparatively, pushed the power to decide as far down that chain as it could possibly be pushed, on the hard, unforgiving logic that a rifle squad standing frozen in place, waiting for permission from an officer 3 ranks and half a battlefield away, would already be dead by the time that permission ever arrived. That greater dependence on centralized authority could, in certain circumstances, make Japanese units more vulnerable to the sudden loss of their leaders than American units, which had been trained from the start to push initiative farther down the line. That was the fourth shock. The fifth shock contradicted very nearly everything that Japanese authorities on Okinawa had told the island's people to expect, and history has done less to remember it than almost anything else in this entire story. Okinawa was different from every one of the other battlefields in one deeply terrible way. It was not an empty fortress island, garrisoned only by soldiers who had come there expressly to fight and die. It was home. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lived there, whole families, farmers, the very old and the very young alike, and they now found themselves caught directly in the path of one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the entire Pacific War. Through the spring of 1945, Japanese military authorities spread a very particular message among that civilian population. The Americans, the islanders, were solemnly warned, were monsters. They tortured their prisoners. They killed, without exception, anyone at all whom they captured. To fall into American hands, the people were told again and again, was a fate far worse than death itself. It was a message deliberately designed to make the people fear the enemy even more than they already feared the war. And it fell upon people who had every reason on earth to be terrified already. And for a great many Okinawan families, that warning set up a truly terrifying collision between the propaganda they had been so carefully fed and the reality that was now coming steadily toward them, because here is what the civilians who came out of hiding actually found waiting for them. They did not find the monsters they had been so thoroughly promised. They found American troops who fed them, troops who treated their wounds and gave clean water to the thirsty, and shared their own rations, their own food, in the very middle of a desperate battle with hungry, frightened families who had been assured that these exact men would murder them all on sight. In case after documented case, American forces guided civilians up out of the danger zone and back towards safety, gently steering the frightened and the lost and the disoriented away from the fighting, and delivering them into the care of others who could shelter and protect them. Families who had walked out of their hiding places, absolutely certain that they were walking to their own deaths, were instead walked to safety. They were fed. Their wounds were bandaged and tended. They were protected and moved carefully out of the path of the guns, and brought back together with one another behind the lines, in places the fighting could no longer reach them. None of this, and this must be said plainly and honestly, erases the hard truths of that war. It would be a dishonesty to pretend that it does. Terrible things happened all across the Pacific on more than one side, and Okinawa held its own full share of horror and tragedy for the people caught helplessly in the middle of it. No honest account of any of this pretends otherwise, or ever should. But the one specific claim, the exact claim that the loudspeakers and the leaflets had hammered home again and again, that surrender to the Americans meant certain torture, and certain death, was for the families who actually lived through it and came out the other side alive, simply and demonstrably false. The propaganda had described an enemy who would sit down in the middle of a battle and share his own rations with the children of the very people he was fighting, and it had called that enemy a murderer. And the reality that walked back out of those hiding places, fed and bandaged and alive, told a very different story indeed than the one the warnings had so confidently promised. That was the fifth shock, and it is worth remembering, and remembering clearly, that the fighting on Okinawa was very far from the Marines alone. The United States Army fought and bled there too in enormous numbers, shoulder to shoulder in the very same terrible campaign. The men who fed those frightened families and led them out of the path of the guns wore more than one uniform between them. This was never the story of a single service or a single kind of unit. It was the story of an entire kind of army and of what that army chose to do when it found the helpless lying directly in its path. The sixth shock lived inside men's heads rather than in any after-action report, which made it of them all the hardest single one to pin down and prove. And yet, in some ways, it may have been the most important of the seven. The assumption behind it had been simple enough, and it followed directly from everything else the Japanese planners already believed to be true. Soldiers fighting for a democracy, men drafted straight out of quiet civilian lives, clerks and mechanics and school teachers, rather than men raised from earliest boyhood to regard death in the emperor's service as the single highest honor a human life could ever hope to hold. Those soldiers, the thinking went, would inevitably fight with something less than total commitment. When the price finally climbed high enough, the ordinary working men in American uniforms would do the sensible, understandable, human thing. They would eventually decide, each in his own heart, that a distant strip of coral on the far side of the world was simply not worth their one and only irreplaceable life, and their will to keep fighting would quietly drain away. What the war revealed instead was a completely different kind of commitment, not less than the Japanese soldiers, just profoundly different in its nature, and aimed in an entirely different direction. It was aimed sideways rather than upward. Many American combat veterans would later try, in their own halting words, to describe what it actually was that kept them moving forward in the very worst moments of battle, and what they described was almost never anything grand. It was not strategy, it was not politics, it was not some distant abstraction called the flag, or the nation, or the cause. It was, over and over again, loyalty to the 3 or 4 other men lying right there in the sand immediately beside them, the men they had trained with, and starved with, and been afraid alongside in the dark. And that loyalty, that fierce, narrow, almost unbreakable devotion to the man on your left and the man on your right, proved in hard practice to be at the very least as unbreakable as anything ever built upon ideology, or emperor worship, or grand national purpose. Perhaps, in the end, it proved even more so, because an ideology can always, eventually, be argued with. The man lying wounded beside you cannot. None of this ever required the men doing it to feel brave in any way at all that they themselves would have recognized as bravery. And this perhaps is the single most human truth in the entire story. The survivors who wrote about combat afterward almost never once described their own courage as an emotion or as anything they had consciously chosen in the moment. They described instead something far narrower and far stranger than that. A kind of tunnel in which the whole roaring, burning, deafening war outside their own tiny fire team briefly, completely ceased to exist, in which the strategy and the enemy and the flag and even their own overwhelming fear all simply fell away and vanished. And the only single fact left standing in the entire world was that the man on their left had just gone down, and that somebody right now had to reach him. They did not run toward the fire because they had somehow stopped being afraid of it. They ran toward it because the only alternative was leaving him lying there, and that was the one thing, the single thing, that they could not bring themselves to do. And no one in this entire story embodied that plain, stubborn truth more completely than the very same sergeant who had held the line south of Henderson Field. John Basilone came home from Guadalcanal to a hero's welcome of the kind that very few men are ever given. He received the Medal of Honor, the single highest decoration his country could bestow upon any soldier, sailor, or Marine. He was sent traveling the length and breadth of the United States to raise money for the war effort, and everywhere he went there were cheering crowds. He was cheered in packed stadiums. He was photographed alongside film stars. He was for a time one of the most famous enlisted men in all of America, and he had every reason in the world to expect that his medal and his fame and his war bond duties could keep him far, far away from another assault beach for the entire rest of the war. And that would not have been cowardice, not in any sense. No one alive would ever have thought a single word less of him for it. He had already done far more than his share, many times over. He had earned his safety 100 times, 1,000 times over. He asked to go back instead. Not once, but again and again and again, he formally requested a return to a combat unit. The famous sergeant, the man whose face was on the posters, kept quietly, stubbornly asking to be sent away from the crowds and the cameras and the safety and back to the war, because what he wanted, more than any of it, was to be with the men he had trained. He did not want to raise money in a stadium, safe and celebrated and alive, while those men went forward and fought and fell somewhere far away without him. And eventually, worn down at last by the sheer persistence of it, the Marine Corps relented and gave him exactly the thing he had been asking for all along. And what he had been asking for, it turned out, was Iwo Jima. Hold that thought for just a moment longer before we go on. Hold on to the image of a man who had every reason in the world to stay home, a genuine national hero, with his country's very highest honor hanging around his neck and the whole grateful nation at his back, with a safe and comfortable and celebrated life laid out in front of him, entirely his for the taking, quietly, stubbornly, and completely refusing all of it, and asking instead over and over to be sent back into the very worst of it, to stand once more, one final time, beside ordinary men in the sand. Because in a very short time now, on a distant island of black volcanic ash, that single decision, that one stubborn human choice, is going to matter more than almost anything else in this entire story. 6 of the 7 shocks had now landed. 6 separate times the Japanese had watched an assumption they had built their entire war upon come apart, completely, right in front of their eyes. There was one shock left, and this last one was different from every single one that had come before it, because this was the one that Japanese commanders genuinely, sincerely believed would finally work. Because on paper, at long last, it truly, genuinely should have. The 7th shock was different from all the ones that came before it, because it did not come from a failure of imagination at all, or from some false and comforting assumption about the enemy. It came instead from a solution, a real one, a good one, born out of hard and honest and clear-eyed thinking about absolutely everything that had gone so catastrophically wrong before. By the autumn of 1944, the pattern had become simply impossible for any thinking officer to keep ignoring. Frontal defense of the beaches had failed over and over and over. Mass charges straight into the teeth of American firepower had failed and failed and failed yet again. Everything built upon the idea of meeting the enemy right at the waterline and breaking his will there, on the sand, in the first hours, all of it had failed from Guadalcanal all the way to Tarawa, and it had failed in blood the Japanese army simply could not begin to spare. And so the defenders finally turned to face the far harder question that all of those failures had been pointing toward all along. If fighting on the beach kept ending every single time in slaughter, then why make the beach the place where the whole battle had to be decided at all? On the island of Peleliu, beginning in September of 1944, the answer took its most fully developed form yet, under the command of a colonel named Kunio Nakagawa. He did not abandon the beaches. That is important. What he abandoned was the idea that the battle had to be decided there. His men still dug in along the shoreline itself. They laid down mines and obstacles and anti-tank ditches, and carefully sighted machine guns and mortars and artillery to tear directly into the landing craft and the men who would come spilling out of them. The beach defenses were entirely real, and they were meant to bleed the landing force badly, right from the first moment. But they were no longer the main event, the decisive point, the place where everything would be won or lost. The real fortress waited farther inland, and, more than that, downward in the coral ridges of a place the maps called the Amurbergol, a jagged, broken spine of rock and jungle running straight through the island's very heart. And into that hard coral rock, Nakagawa's men had carved a fortress that could not be seen at all from the air, and could barely even be touched from the sea. More than 500 caves. Tunnels linking one to the next, dug on multiple levels, one directly above another, with firing positions cut straight into the living stone and heavy steel doors that could be rolled shut tight against a naval barrage. It was, in its own grim way, a genuine masterpiece of defensive engineering, and it was designed, from first to last, to do one single thing: to force the Americans to come in and dig them out, one cave at a time, at the very highest possible cost in lives. His men could fire from a hidden slit in the rock, cutting down the attackers on the ground below them, and then simply vanish back deeper into the mountain before the shell that answered them ever even landed. American commanders had confidently predicted the island would fall in 4 days. It did not fall in 4 days. It took more than 2 full months. And to this very day, the Marine Corps' own official history still lists Peleliu among the single costliest battles, measured by casualties for every man engaged, that the Corps has ever fought in the whole long history of its existence. Nakagawa's honeycomb of stone should have held even longer than it did. By every established principle of war, this way of fighting should have been the thing that finally, at long last, worked. And the reason it did not is the very thread that ties this entire story together, the same thread that runs all the way back, unbroken, to that riverbank in the dark. Because the same enemy who could not be broken by machine guns on Guadalcanal, the very same men who did not run at Alligator Creek, who waited across the lagoon at Tarawa under fire they could not even answer, who kept coming after their leaders lay dead on the slopes of Iwo Jima, that same enemy did not simply hurl itself blindly against Nakagawa's mountain and die there at the foot of it. It adapted, and it adapted faster than his brilliant, patient, carefully engineered defense had ever once accounted for. Marine engineers stopped trying to storm the cave mouths head-on, straight into the waiting guns. Instead, they began methodically to seal them with explosives and with fire. Tanks fitted with flame projectors rolled up close and burned the defenders out of positions that no rifle bullet on Earth could ever have reached. Combat teams learned, cave by cave by cave, to isolate a single system at a time, to cut off its water and its ammunition and its very air, and then simply to wait it out. It was slower than the defenders had feared, and it was more total than they had ever planned for. There was no glorious final battle waiting at the end of it. There was only the patient, relentless, methodical reduction of the entire fortress, one sealed cave at a time. On the 24th of November, deep into a battle his own headquarters had confidently expected to see finished within a matter of days, Nakagawa sent out a final message. "Our sword is broken," he reported, "and we have run out of spears." Then he burned his regimental colors, so that the enemy could never take them as a trophy, and he ended his own life rather than surrender. But the tactics demonstrated so brutally at Peleliu did not die with the man who had commanded that defense. Peleliu had become one of the clearest and most fully developed examples yet of a Japanese defense-in-depth doctrine that had been steadily evolving across the whole long, bloody chain of Pacific battles. A way of fighting the Japanese had been refining, island by hard island, out of everything that each earlier defeat had painfully taught them. The lessons of it were studied, they were refined further still, and within a matter of months they were carried forward to that same island of black volcanic sand called Iwo Jima, and then again, still later, to Okinawa. Each and every time, the defenders built positions specifically designed to make the eventual American victory unbearably, unforgettably expensive. Each time, the cost was entirely real and terrible, and it was paid in full, right to the last coin. And each time, and this is the part that matters most of all, the position still, in the end, fell. The method that should have changed everything only ever managed to change the price. It never once changed the outcome, and at Iwo Jima, one single man would take that entire logic further than anyone before him had ever dared. Which brings us, at long last, all the way back to the general who had understood all of this before any of it had even begun. Tadamichi Kurikibayashi, the man who had ridden those American trains, who had seen those American factories with his own eyes, who had understood from the very start exactly how strong and exactly how casualty-conscious his enemy would turn out to be, took command of the island of Iwo Jima, knowing almost with certainty that he would die there upon it. He was not a man who fooled himself about that or anything else. He had studied and fully absorbed every hard lesson the other islands had to teach, and he refused, flatly and completely, to waste his men the way so many other commanders before him had wasted theirs. He forbade the suicidal mass charges, the wild, honor-driven attacks that had thrown away thousands upon thousands of lives on other beaches, and accomplished nothing whatsoever in the end but to fill the American guns with easy targets. That, he had finally come to understand, was precisely the behavior the Americans had by now learned to cut down like so much wheat before a scythe. He gave his men a very different order instead. A colder one, a far grimmer one. Every soldier's duty, he told them plainly, was not to die gloriously in one single magnificent charge. It was to survive, to hold, to make each and every American pay and then pay again for every single yard of that black volcanic sand, and then after that to stay alive just long enough to keep right on making them pay for the next yard and the next. It was a cold and terrible arithmetic. And it was aimed at the single purpose he had understood was his only real option from the very beginning, to make the capture of one small island as staggeringly expensive, in American lives and American time, as one small island could ever possibly be made to be. And it worked in the only sense that the man had any measure left available to him. The American command had expected to secure Iwo Jima in roughly a week. Kuribayashi held it for 36 days. Somewhere on that island, in those first terrible hours of it, was a face we have already met once before, in a very different place. John Basilone had gotten his wish. He had come back. He landed with the 5th Marine Division on the black sand of Iwo Jima on the 19th of February 1945. The man who had every reason on this earth to be safe at home, standing once again among the very men he had trained. And on that first day he did precisely what he had always done. When a Japanese blockhouse pinned down his company with fire, Basilone worked his way forward to it and knocked it out, breaking wide open the position that had them trapped. When a friendly tank became caught fast in a minefield under fire, he moved out across open ground to help guide it clear. He had crossed an entire ocean to get back to these men. He had turned his back on a safe and honored life, exactly the kind of life the whole country would have gladly applauded him for taking. For the single chance to stand beside them one more time. He lasted only hours on that island, and he spent those hours in the only way he had ever known how to spend them, moving toward the men who needed him, out in the open, under fire, doing the job in front of him, until a mortar round found him and ended it. He did not survive that first day. He was 28 years old. The Japanese defenders on that stretch of beach never learned his name. They had no way at all to know who he was or what he had already done once before on another island, or what he had willingly given up in order to be there at all. They knew only what they had always known on every island, going all the way back to the very beginning of it, that the American assault in front of them, once again, did not stop when everything they believed told them, with certainty, that it should have. The sergeant who had once held a line on Guadalcanal had crossed the entire width of the Pacific Ocean, only to die moving forward on a beach of black sand for no reason grander and no reason smaller than the men who happened to be with him. And Kuribayashi, the one man who understood the Americans best of all, never saw the end of it. He held his island for 36 days against a force that had confidently expected to need only a week. And then, in the closing days of March 1945, with his command in ruins all around him, and the outcome long since decided beyond any possible doubt, he is believed to have led a final attack himself, on foot, in the very oldest fashion of all, an old general at the head of the last of his surviving men. The exact date of it is still disputed by historians to this very day. His body was never found and never identified. In an earlier letter home to his wife, he had told her not to look for him among the dead, because there might, he warned her gently, be nothing left of him worth finding. And the fighting did not simply stop the moment the island was declared secure. As of the 26th of March, the Marines had taken only 216 prisoners, and many even of those were Korean laborers. But the declaration that the main operation was finally over did not in any way mean that the island was empty of the enemy. Out of a garrison of roughly 21,000 men, thousands of Japanese soldiers still remained concealed within the caves and the tunnels, and army patrols went right on fighting them and capturing holdouts through the whole of April and on into May. Some of them emerged only after weeks alone in the dark. A few would hold out, almost unbelievably, for far, far longer than that. Kurabayashi's cold arithmetic had been built from the very first to make the island cost as much as it possibly could, and it went right on collecting that terrible price even after the flags had all been raised and the cameras had gone home. And here at the very end is the thing that should stay with you long after the individual names themselves begin to fade. The men who left this record behind, Kawaguchi with his graveyard, Nakagawa with his broken sword, Kuribashishi with his letters home, and the countless other officers and soldiers whose reports and interrogations and diaries somehow survived the war even when they themselves did not. Every one of those men was writing on the losing side of it, and their testimony cannot simply be taken at face value merely because they lost. That is a rule that any honest telling of this has to follow, without exception. A defeated officer has every reason in the world to describe his enemy as larger and stronger and more terrible than he truly was, because an unbeatable enemy neatly explains a defeat and soothes a wounded pride in a way that the plain and simple truth very often will not. This is precisely why their words alone are not the evidence here, and never were. But when their accounts are laid down side by side and read carefully against the operational records and against the cold casualty reports, and against the plain, undeniable arithmetic of the battlefield itself, the length of battles that were supposed to be short and swift, the number of men who went in measured against the pitiful number who ever came back out, then certain patterns begin to emerge that become very, very difficult indeed to simply explain away. On different islands in different years, without ever once coordinating with one another, without ever comparing a single note, the men on the losing side kept running headlong into the very same wall over and over. The enemy that their entire strategy had been so carefully built to expect, soft, comfortable, sentimental, unwilling in the end to pay any truly serious price for anything at all, did not exist. He had never once existed. And in his place stood something that their whole way of thinking about war had no vocabulary for at all. An army built out of drafted civilians, out of tailors' sons and farmhands and schoolteachers that fought with the stubborn, unyielding persistence of fanatics. And that still somehow found the time, in the very middle of the fighting, to carry wounded strangers out of the fire and to walk terrified families to safety. Popular memory, for the most part, has quietly moved on from these islands now. The war in Europe gave us Normandy, and with it a whole vast library of films and books and names that very nearly everyone still knows by heart. The Pacific gave us one single photograph, a flag, rising over a mountain called Suribachi, on that same island of Iwo Jima that nearly everyone still recognizes on sight, and very little else at all that most people today could even name. Tarawa, Peleliu, the Maruyama Trail, Alligator Creek. For most people now, the names have simply gone quiet and still, but the men who were actually there on the side that lost left behind a very different kind of record. Again and again, on island after island after island, they set down their own careful account of an enemy they had absolutely refused to believe in, right up until the evidence, the terrible and relentless and repeated evidence, finally made refusing to believe in him any longer completely impossible. So return one final time to that riverbank in the dark. August of 1942, 900 men sent forward across the sand against an enemy their commander had catastrophically underestimated. They were proven wrong within a single day, and the men who came after them spent the next 3 long years discovering, one bloody island at a time, just precisely how wrong they had truly been. Not because the American Marines were supermen. They were not, and it does the real men no honor whatsoever to pretend for even a moment that they were. They were not immune to fear, or to pain, or to the plain and simple and entirely human instinct to stay alive one more single day. They were frightened young men who kept right on fighting anyway, who carried their wounded out under fire for no tactical reason on earth at all beyond the plain stubborn fact that they would not, could not, leave them behind, who kept moving forward into the guns after their leaders lay dead in the sand, because no one had ever once told them that their leaders being dead was any kind of reason to stop. And so we come back at the very, very end to the question that this whole battlefield record leaves behind for us, the one single thing that nothing in all their doctrine, and all their careful planning, and all their long and serious study of war had ever taught the men on the other side how to beat. What was it, in the end, about these men that Japanese strategy kept failing, again and again and again, to account for? 7 separate times, in 7 different ways, across the whole vast and terrible width of the Pacific, the war itself asked that exact question, and every single time, without one exception, the answer came back out the same. It was not that the American Marines fought without fear. It was that whatever it was they were afraid of mattered to them, in the end, less than the man standing right beside them in the sand. And that one simple, stubborn, deeply human thing was the single weapon that no Japanese war college had ever once taught its officers how to defeat.